Welcome to my tutorial of Kaze and the Wild Masks. And this is a Switch version. This was on a few platforms. I know it's at least on Steam. And I actually got it on sale for about $5, but I think it goes for something like $30 now. It was a huge sale. It was like 90-something% off, but then it went back up to $30. In my review of this game, when I do the review, I'll probably go into a little bit more detail about how much I think the game's worth, but I would probably say, try to get it in the $10 or $15 range. So here, I started it on original mode, and it took me around 5 hours and 21 minutes to beat. If you're accustomed to platforming games, then it doesn't really get too challenging until maybe the last few actual worlds. A lot of it really wasn't, that difficult. But luckily, on original mode anyway, I don't know about the other mode, but on original mode you get unlimited lives. There is no live system. It's just like you start up at whatever checkpoint you got to, you start at. Now, I don't know what happens if you shut the game off, if you didn't finish a stage. I would always finish a stage or leave the game in rest mode, so I didn't really experience that. So I can't say how the game saves exactly, but it probably at least starts you on the stage that you got to. So it seems good with that. You have... The controls are pretty much ripped straight out of Donkey Kong Country. With Diddy, you kind of have this control scheme where you kind of hover in the air, if I'm remembering that game right. But you also have your spin attack, which is kind of like Donkey Kong's roll or Diddy's cartwheel. Very similar. It's pretty much like if you like Donkey Kong Country, then this is a nice little kind of like somewhat of a clone game. It has its own style to it, but even the letters that you collect and shit are like Donkey Kong Country, So you can see all the little influences here. The way you bounce off enemies, very similar control. But that's a good thing, because, those are some of my favorite platformers, so this is imitating a great series. So, it's not going to start to get more challenging until later. But I figured I would do commentary over it since it was a cool game. I'm going to have to refresh my memory a little bit as I watch this footage, which I edited all the deaths out for this footage. It's the same footage as I posted in my playthrough of the game, where it was all, that was also edited with all the deaths removed, though I did edit it a little bit. I cut it down a little bit more than that version. I cut out all the bonus stages, which I fucked around with. In the beginning of the game, I fucked around with some bonus stages to try them out. But you really don't need to do any of that shit if you're just looking to beat the game. So this is just a tutorial on how I beat the game. So nothing about bonus stages or, trying to collect everything, as I don't really give a shit about that. But I thought it would be cool to, kind of detail some strats, which I'll remember as I see the video again. I also cut out the ending and any of the cutscenes and things like that. But it still comes out to, close to an hour and a half without any death. So it's a decent amount of stages. Definitely not $30 worth of stages, though. But, it is still quite a good little platformer. So, collecting the letters is something I stopped doing a little later on. But, earlier on I was kind of just fucking around. And I didn't know exactly how the game worked as far as progression. Some games will force you to collect a certain amount of shit to progress. This game, luckily, doesn't do that, because I never liked that. In this game, all you have to do is, get to the end of each stage. There's a goal at the end of each stage. You jump in the porthole, and that's it. You end the stage, and at the end of each world, you'll fight a boss. So that's pretty much it. Very simple. But some stages are tricky. As with a lot of, 8 and 16-bit style games and old arcade games, it's really about memorizing a path. You can pretty much duplicate everything. And you see that's a death. I usually edited those out, but there's probably going to be a few that didn't make it in editing, since I didn't watch this over. But it should be mostly cut out. But I don't think I got to a checkpoint in that case, so it started me at the beginning of the stage. So that's how it works, But once you get to the checkpoints, the checkpoints are, when you see a statue, that's a checkpoint. There's a small statue. Then there's a large statue that transforms you into some kind of creature. That counts as a checkpoint. And I think those are the main things to look out for as far as checkpoints go. And that means that you'll start back there no matter how many times you die. You'll always go back to the checkpoint. So something to keep in mind. So here's a checkpoint, this little statue here. Just make sure to hit them. I think you have to hit into them to activate them, but very simple. The hearts will give you some health back, I believe. I think you can only take 2 hits most of the time. Or I think actually you can only take 1 hit, but if you collect the heart, then maybe you can take 2 hits if I remember right. So you got these little bouncy things. You just bounce on them, obviously, to get a little height. There's really not too much complexity in this early part of the game. So as far as collecting the gems, there's really no reason to do it unless you're going, as a completionist trying to get like 100% or something. Otherwise than that, there's really no point to collect anything except the health pickups. So, don't even make these little side journeys you see me doing to collect the letters and shit. Don't even waste your time unless that's what you want to do. But if you're just looking to beat the game, as I was, then you don't even have to do any of that shit. You're not going to get gated off or anything where you can't proceed any further. So you can just keep playing through the stages. There may be some kind of bonus stages you can access, like maybe new stages altogether with enemies and shit. If you collect enough shit, see, I can't go to this stage. It has a question mark on it. So maybe those are actually exclusive stages you unlock if you actually collect shit. But I couldn't be bothered with any of that, so I couldn't tell you. But I mean, at least the game does have tight control. One of the better aspects of it is that there's these different animals and shit you can transform into, which really does change up the gameplay. And the final boss makes good use of that, where you have to pretty much go through all the animal transformations and play some areas before beating the final boss, so it's cool. It's a cool ending. So now is our first animal transformation. This is the bird. And the bird, it pretty much plays just like you remember Donkey Kong Country 2 with the parrot. So, though these stages, some of them can get pretty challenging later on, none of them are nearly as hard as the Lost World in Donkey Kong Country 2, which I did a tutorial on, where I don't even remember the name of the stage, but you have to go through all these animals and shit, and the one with the parrot was the hardest one, and that's a tricky part, and it's similar looking to this. Very similar to this in the way it looks and everything, but much, much harder in that game. And most of these really aren't that challenging. I mean, to me anyway. You got to play carefully, but they're easy enough, I thought. That's going to vary, though, from player to player. You mostly just need to know where to go, obviously, and just try to get there when you have an opening. And most of the game, there's not going to be a ton to explain, except for a few little things here and there that I missed, that I once I figured out did save me a lot of time. So there's a few things I'll be able to help with as far as that goes. Mostly what I'm going to say throughout this playthrough, my best advice is going to be like to find a path and memorize it. And if you're having trouble, then try to follow my movements as close as you can. And that should work, but most of the time I'm going to say try to practice and try to find your own paths, and whatever works, keep that in. But if something doesn't work, then change it up. That's how these old arcade and 16-bit games really are. It's all about finding that path because it's pretty much the same every time you play it. The only thing that changes is what you do as a player. So the game layout, everything is paced the same usually. It's just if you do something a little different, you may cause a little bit of a different reaction from the enemies or from the environment. So, you got to be consistent to get through these kind of stages, basically. So, it's the same kind of principles as those old games. Ghost and Goblins on Legend is another one I'm working on, and that's a brutal mode, and that's one of the harder games that I'm going to complete on the channel. But I'm working on that on and off, and on that game, even though it's similar in that arcade style where there's like a path that you can kind of memorize and carve out, at the same time it almost feels dynamic, like the game throws in extra shit at you, you know. But I think that's just because the game is so fucking dense. The gameplay is so dense and difficult that, you know, if you do one thing just slightly differently, you can really change up the patterns of how shit reacts. So I think it just feels like it's dynamic. But, you know, if you mastered that game, you could probably, you know, play it like Super Mario Brothers speedrunners do, where they master each movement and the game reacts exactly the same. I would imagine you could do that with that game, but I'm not able to do that. So for me, the game feels a little bit like you can memorize, you know, 90% of it, but there's that 10% little variance of bullshit occurring and getting me killed. And, you know, that's like pretty much at every moment in that game because it's really fucking dense. But I'm sure that's just because I haven't completely, you know, mastered the checkpoints. So I would have to really have the game down to say if you know, if it follows that. But I think it probably does have patterns, like most of these games. So yeah, these little pots, if you break them on the enemies, you can get some extra health and shit usually. So if you need an extra hit, you can grab that. I'm guessing that little thing floating by you indicates that you can take an extra hit. That's my guess. I wasn't really paying attention to it when I played the game. But I noticed if I grabbed the heart, I could usually take an extra hit, so I think that's what it does. Still very simple, just climbing on these vines, you know, just time it. Go up or under, either way, whatever you want to do. Still very simple, nothing too tricky as of yet. But the game will ramp up. I mean, difficulty fairly balanced, I would say, overall, but there are some spikes here and there that are like uncharacteristic of the rest of the game. You know, it's like kind of a bit of a spike here and there, and then it calms down a little bit. So it's not completely even. There's definitely like certain stages that stood out as being harder, while others, you know, even on the final world, there's some stages that are easier than some of the earlier stages. So it's not like a steady increase in difficulty. It's kind of moves around a little bit. But there is some consistency. So yeah, that's it for this stage. Very easy. Some of the bosses are not super straightforward, so I think this tutorial will be also useful for that. And there was also some of the platforming stages where there was a mechanic I didn't understand, and I wasted a lot of time. So I'm going to explain that right off the bat. That will save some time. Things like that should help. This tutorial will probably be more useful for players who are either just watching it for entertainment, you know, to watch a playthrough with some commentary, or for specific sections that you may be stuck on while playing. I mean, for a game that's not that hard, I don't really generally recommend watching like the entire tutorial first before playing it, because it's really not that difficult. I mean, unless you're new to platformers, then maybe. But I mean, as far as like if you play these kind of games, and you've been playing them for a while, then I don't think it's, you know, there's probably only going to be a few parts that stand out a little bit. So it's not like you're going to struggle with every moment of the game. So here's the first stage where you can collect. You see the edit there. I edit the deaths out at the checkpoints, so you'll see a little jankiness at the checkpoints where the deaths are edited out. You know, most of the time I did die on a lot of the checkpoints learning what was coming up. So this stage introduces a mechanic where you got to touch these white bulb flowers, and we're going to be dealing with that later in the game, and it's going to be used in a much more difficult way, but here it's pretty simple. Whenever you touch these white bulbs, it makes the enemies kind of cower down where they can't hurt you, and then after a few seconds they rise back up and then they can hurt you again. So that's all that's going on here. So you want to hit these bulbs and just keep moving, basically. But yeah, I mean, it really comes down to with these games is memorizing, finding the path and memorizing it really is the main key. It wouldn't be of any benefit for me to try to narrate all my movements, you know. So a lot of these tutorials, I just try to focus on key points and stuff that might be easy to miss, instead of trying to detail every little thing. I made the mistake with my Gunsmoke tutorial for arcade. Brutal fucking game that I did a tutorial for. And at times I made the mistake of trying to, explain every little movement that I was doing near the end for some difficult sections, and I just didn't have time to explain it. And I had to cut off what I was saying, and then after the video ended, I had to add more dialogue to try to go back over it again, and it was kind of a mess. The tutorial came out a little bit sloppier than I would have liked, but it's just a brutal fucking game, and some of these games are real hard to keep up with vocally, to match what's going on screen, unless you slow it down and shit. But I don't have those kind of editing skills as of yet, so I just gotta talk over the game as it plays out. So now we have our first stage that has a little water going on. Now you can do some diving and shit, but the water doesn't really get too fleshed out until you get the shark power up, or the shark transformation, which I don't know if it's in this stage, but we'll see if it is. Some of these stages are kind of a blur because these were pretty easy. I didn't spend a lot of time on these stages, these earlier ones. Most of that 5 hours and 20-something minutes was on the later areas. That's when I started to slow down a little bit. Some of the stages got me stuck for a little while. Oh, here we go. So now we got the fucking shark. The shark is kind of cool. It's your typical swimming, transformation kind of thing in games. Now, one thing I didn't know, and you're not going to see me do it early on, but I'm going to tell you about it. You can fucking thank me later, you fucking sack of shit. But yeah, and I'm just fucking. You're all right, man. You ain't that bad. But yeah. So if you hold down the, I think it's the attack button. It's not the button that makes you do your drill attack. You see here, it's the other button. I think it's the first button, maybe jump button. If you hold that down, you can actually increase your speed. It's like running. You know what I mean? It's like running in Super Mario Brothers, except you're swimming. You'll increase your base speed. So if you hold that down, you're just going to move faster without having to spam the drill attack. You see, I was spamming the drill attack to try to move faster. Not necessary. I mean, it helps, but I could have been moving faster the whole time if I would have held down the jump button. Then I could have been swimming faster as my base speed. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to, move at a snail pace like I was. I mean, maybe you want to, though. It makes it easier sometimes because you don't have to react this fast. But I would have preferred, I like moving fast. I would have preferred to move fast. You can go in between these if you want. I think you're supposed to go around them, but I'm pretty fucking aggressive. So sometimes I will do illogical things. I kind of see things as an A to B fucking, you know what I mean? An A to B fucking puzzle. It's just I just want to get to the fucking end. So I kind of want to cut through the bullshit, so I can be aggressive. I don't like waiting for platforms and shit, so you'll see me sometimes I don't wait around. I try to just fucking gun it. So now we have our first boss. Boss is a little tricky. It's actually, maybe one of the harder bosses. I mean, because some of the bosses really aren't that hard, at least not for me. I didn't find them to be that difficult, but this one's a little tricky. It really only has a few patterns, but, it goes on for a little while. You got to go through 3 phases. When it shoots that whole column of spikes and moves to one side, you want to basically just run to the end of where the spikes stop falling, and that's where your safe spot is, but it's kind of hard to explain. All right, so now, yeah, once it does this, you can just jump down in the middle and get your first hit, and if you hit it 2 more times, it's dead. So for these, you want to kind of stay on the other side, and it's easy to dodge. For that, you see how there's gaps in the end of these spikes? You want to get in those gaps, which might take a little practice. But you see these are not too hard to dodge. I think you can see the pattern with me explaining it a little bit. I didn't explain it great, but hopefully it's kind of... That's you just stay in the middle for that. And then that means he's going to do his slam down when you want to avoid the slam, and then you can very easily climb up those leaves and whatever the hell they are and jump down in the middle. Just stay in these gaps. I usually like to stay on the opposite side of the boss because it makes it easier to dodge a lot of his attacks. But you can run with those spikes when he's going left to right. Just run with the spikes and stay in the gaps. I think that's the best way I can explain it. Then you're going to be jumping some of these spiky things for a little while, and then he's going to go into his final little part where he does that shot that has a gap in the middle where you just stay in the middle. And then move to the left or right and jump up here and do this. And that's pretty much it. It's very simple, but it is a little challenging. I mean, some of the bosses were actually easier than this, I thought. There was one boss that I beat on my first try. I thought that was the easiest boss in the game, but maybe I was just playing well. There was a lot of stuff to dodge, but I ended up not even getting hit on it. So that was the easiest one for me, but it's going to vary for players. So here I'm fucking around checking out a little bit of the cutscene, but usually I get bored within a few seconds, and I usually skip them. Now, I would have edited this out, but like I said, my editing is not going to be perfect because I had to edit through about 5.5 hours of video, and I didn't want to bother to actually watch my playthrough because it really wasn't that entertaining to watch because the game really isn't that fucking difficult. If it was a really hard game or something, I'd kind of be interested to watch over it again, but this was kind of just a mundane game with, a few challenging sections, which I did watch I posted up some previews of some of the harder sections that I posted up. And I watched those videos to check those because those came out pretty cool. But, the game as a whole, it really only had a few challenging parts that stood out for me a little bit. There's really not that many worlds. Maybe there's 4 worlds or something like that, 4 or 5. There's not a lot. I don't remember exactly, but I remember it wasn't a lot. But the game is a decent length. I think there's only 4 worlds, if I remember right. So this stage, the new mechanic here, it's not really a new mechanic, but it is for this game, is slippery controls now. So when your feet are on the ice, you're going to slide around a little bit more. It makes the controls a little shittier, basically. So, you just got to, adapt your brain and your muscle memory to the slippery controls, and then it'll start to feel normal. But you just got to get used to that little change. There is also a ground pound. If you press down and I guess the attack button, you'll pound into the ground, which can sometimes get you to jump straight into a pit if you fuck it up. So I'm not really a big fan of those moves in these games, but luckily it didn't fuck me up too much. I was also using a joystick for this game mostly, so it makes it a lot easier not to hit the diagonals. I mean, with a D-pad, it can be easier to hit diagonals and do those ground pounds in the pits and stuff, but this game actually played great with a joystick. But any decent controller will be fine, as long as the D-pad is good. Of course, you got to hold your little hover button to hover in the air. You can hold it as long as you want, and you'll hover. I don't want to assume that players know all the controls from all these kind of games, but it's definitely a copy and paste from Donkey Kong Country games, especially the second one. So now we have another new mechanic. You see, the game does introduce new mechanics into the gameplay pretty often, which is usually the sign of a good game. Though some games will switch it up too much and they will execute everything poorly. Of course, those are not good games, but this is well done. So you can get a little heart here, I believe that's what that is. But mostly you're going to be, bouncing on shit and going into these slingshots. So you're going to have to get used to pretty much memorizing the layouts. This is the first real difficulty spike, I would say, because everything else has been pretty painless, I thought, but it starts to get a little bit more challenging here with some of the paths. The main idea is you got to go into those ballistas and you got to kind of time your movements from one to the other. You're going to be airborne a lot of times, going bouncing off shit. Whenever you see those guys with the leaf helmets, those are guys that the game wants you to bounce off of. So the game is actually telling you what to bounce off of once you recognize that those characters mean to bounce off of them, pretty much. That's pretty much your cue. Which could be something that players might miss, but it becomes obvious after a while that that those characters mean that you're supposed to bounce off of them. Sometimes you want to bounce off tomatoes and shit, though, too, so it's not always just those guys, but it is one of the cues. But yeah, basically you're going to be trying to follow, if you don't know where to go exactly, you're going to want to go in the order of ballistas that I go into. Because sometimes if you go in the wrong one, you will get shot off, into a bad area, like you'll be dead or something like that. So you do want to do things in a certain order. Of course, you want to get to this bottom one here, and that will take you through. Some of the parts are almost automatic, so there's not always a lot required. But that one maybe could be a little tricky for, the first stage is maybe a little tricky. I don't know if that was one of the harder ones early on. Like I said, I don't remember, even though I beat it a few days ago, I don't remember all the details on some of these stages. As far as specifics, of which ones were the hardest early stages, but I just didn't have a ton of trouble until a little later. I had some more trouble, but so now is like a little bonus that you can skip. See, this stage you can't go to unless you collected 7 of those green things. Whatever the fuck those are. I think you get those from the bonus stages that I wasn't doing anymore. So you're always free to do that if you want to do some extra shit. The good thing is, though, you can always go back later and go for 100% completion. So I would say in your first playthrough, if you just want to have more fun with the game, maybe just beat the game first and then ignore all the bonus shit. And then if you really like the game, go back and do them. I don't know. I mean, that's what I would do if I was going to do it. Unless you're just a completionist type of player, and you know that you're going to go for 100% anyway, then I guess you could just take your time and complete each stage 100% before moving on. You could do that as well. Whatever you like to do. So this stage, again, some more new mechanics here. You're going to be using these as a shield, so you want to move with them to shield you from the icicles. You can also ride them. So it mixes it up a little bit more. Sometimes the spin attack does work well to move fast to avoid the icicles. Don't forget you can also lure the icicles out a little bit by going ahead a little bit and then immediately retreating back to get the icicle to drop. Don't do that, obviously. But yeah, you're just going to be riding these things. Avoid the spikes. Nothing too complicated here. And now we always get a checkpoint whenever we get to these transformation statues. These are also checkpoints as well. So if you die, you'll start back here. As you see, I did. You can see by that janky edit that I started back here. So now I think this is our first time with this form. I mean, I thought this was like a fucking tiger or some shit. But, honestly, now that I look at it, pay attention, I don't know what the fuck it is. Something. But, it's probably like a fucking squirrel or some shit. I don't know. But, this guy can do an air dash, and he can climb on walls. So that's pretty big. So you're going to be doing a lot of bouncing now, where you got to, do an air dash, bounce off an enemy to get to the other side kind of thing. Now you can climb these walls, but you can only climb on the matte surfaces. If it's a shiny surface, like with the little icicle on it or whatever, the ice, you can't. You'll slide off of that. So don't touch it if there's ice on there. You can't grab onto those. Maybe you can grab onto it, but you'll slide down. So don't bother. But yeah, that's about it. So here we're going to do a little dash across and bounce off the enemy. So now you're going to switch wall to wall. I was trying to brute force it, but you want to go to the other wall. Get a little health here. Try not to hit in anything. Pretty simple, though. You're just doing some dashing and jumping. But you can see it is spiking up a little bit. It's starting to get a little bit more aggressive here. It can get a little challenging. You have to play well. It's not like you can take a ton of damage in this game, but it's pretty straightforward with a little bit of practice. Nothing too crazy. Like I said, you just got to practice a little and find those paths. And the game will never get too dense, but it does get pretty complex later on, especially if you're not as advanced at platforming games. You may have trouble later on, but there is a method to it. There's definitely a rhythm to the gameplay. So if you're having trouble with it, you just got to find that rhythm by practicing and failing until you start to carve out that path little by little. That's really the key to these games. Even the ones that are much harder than this, it's the same principle. It just takes a fuck ton longer to learn them. That's all. But it's always the same kind of principle. Now, some of them will require obviously a lot more dedication. You'll have to just be stubborn and put in a shit ton of time. And depending on your skill level and how fast you learn, it's going to take some players longer than others. So, some of these harder games do require a lot more, but I think this one is pretty approachable for most platform players. I wouldn't call it a beginner game, though, either. I think it's probably going to be, it'd be considered very hard for somebody just starting with platformers or just new to games in general. I wouldn't say it's a beginner game, but it's probably like an intermediate difficulty game if I had to rate it. So here you got to kind of slide up and down. And just stay in the gaps, that's all. Get another checkpoint here. It is starting to get more challenging, though, as you can see. So yeah, if you come down on this rope a little low, you can come up and get that little extra heart if you want it. Just hover down here. Really no point to collect these gems, so unless you're trying to get completionist shit or something. So just stay in the gaps, basically. It may take a few tries to get used to that. Those wooden platforms will collapse, so you got to keep moving and bouncing off of shit. But yeah, not too bad. So yeah, let's see what this stage is. I don't remember what this stage introduces. If there's anything new. More of the same shit, pretty much. I think though, I think these surfaces are at least not slippery here in the beginning, so you can play normally. Maybe there's some wind or some shit. I don't remember if the wind pushes you back. It just wasn't that memorable, whatever the fuck the stage was. Definitely didn't stand out. I don't think this stage is particularly difficult. So now we get our little bird transformation and the next checkpoint. So this one might be maybe it's a little challenging. The bird scenes can be a little tricky, but I found most of them pretty painless, was able to get through them pretty fast. I was pretty familiar, like I said, the one in DKC2, the optional bonus world, the Lost World, had a very hard stage with that. And so this felt like a vacation compared to that, Although it did play very similar to that. But it was just, way fucking easier. So these didn't take too long. But you do have to play carefully. You want to kind of, you don't want to mash the flap of your wings. You want to kind of time and feel each little wing flap, you know what I mean, to make sure you're not like pressing it too many times, recklessly and flying up into the spikes and shit. You kind of want to tap it very carefully. That's mainly what I did. I would tap it once at a time or a few taps. You don't want to mash, though. If you mash, you're going to probably fly in all kinds of shit. So that might be an easy beginner mistake to make, but it will help if you just kind of tap carefully and try to stay in the gaps, but just be patient and, try to do precise movements and not tap just for the fuck of it, Because if you just start tapping the button quickly, you're going to fly in all kinds of shit. So, do 1 or 2 taps at a time and just kind of carefully move through the gaps. That applies to all the little bird sequences in the game. There's really not too many of them, but there is a few. So now we have some more bouncing off of shit. So this is our first transformation into this character, the dragon or whatever it is. And whenever you see this dragon, it is a auto-scroller stage. It's the only time that the game becomes an auto-scroller, which means that the screen scrolls, with or without your assistance, the screen will scroll. So you're just going to have to, to work with it and react to it. So basically, you don't even need to use the D-pad for these sequences except for when you do a downward dive. So this character has a double jump and a downward dive. Now, the downward dive, the one thing that's kind of shitty about the downward dive is it doesn't have much of an angle to it. It's pretty much like straight down. I mean, it's a little bit of an angle, but it can be kind of shitty because you want it to kind of go a little farther diagonally. At least I did, and it has to be pretty dead on for it to work. Because you're going to have to plan your dives so that you do them pretty dead on to the target that you're trying to hit. So the main thing is you're going to have to know when to double jump and when to bounce off shit. That's the main thing with this area. Whenever you have to play these kind of stages, so you have to dive on that. The way you know to dive on that is whenever you see those guys with the lettuce helmets, the game is telling you to bounce off of them, and it's usually a dive you have to do. So that's how you know what to do here. See the guy with the lettuce helmet? I dived on him. Well, that time I didn't have to dive on him, but you can. But it's pretty much telling you to bounce off or dive off of those guys. So that's the cue. So when you're playing that, just remember that. If you don't know exactly how to get through there, without having to check my video again, just use the cues. It'll tell you everything you need to know about those stages for the most part. When you see those guys with the lettuce helmet, you got to either dive at them or land on them somehow. So landing or diving pretty much has the same result when you hit an enemy. It doesn't spring you any farther up if you dive onto something, as far as what I remember. So just make sure you get your ass to bounce off of that enemy when you see it, is the general idea. Whether you want to do a dive or a bounce, whatever works better for the situation. Sometimes you have to do a dive, I think, to get on them. But that's something you can work out without even watching the video. But just make sure you bounce off of them. Because pretty much whenever you see those guys with the lettuce helmet, it means you got to fucking bounce off of them. It might be a skip here and there, but for the most part. So this introduces something new where if you hover where that smoke is coming up, you're gonna rise up with it, and you can kind of just rise all the way up if you hold it down, if you just hover in place. So that's just like what you're dealing with now. It's a new little thing they added here. So don't forget to let off the hover button so you don't hover up into the spikes. You want to kind of just do it carefully. You don't want to overdo it. Some parts you can hold it down for a while and go all the way up to the top of the screen with no consequences, but other times you want to be more careful. Like in narrow corridors with spikes on the top and bottom, you got to just hold it a little bit and let off so that you can kind of stay in the middle of a corridor. You don't want to go too far up or too far down, so you got to get your timing right with that. That's all it is. You can be patient and kind of hang back till you have clearance to move right, though, too. You don't have to try to fly through it or speed run it. So, be patient with it. Make sure you have clearance from the projectiles and enemies if you're having trouble. Generally, I like to try to be aggressive when I can. I don't really like waiting around, but you don't have to. You can be pretty patient with it. It's not like you're on a timer or anything, and it's not an auto-scroller like the last area, so you can kind of just take your time. It shouldn't be too hard. So now we have a boss. Now this was the only boss in the game that I beat on the first try, and I beat it with no damage. So, from my perspective, very easy fucking boss. But, that can vary. I do remember it does throw a lot of shit out, though, so I could see it being a hard boss for other players. There's a lot of shit to navigate, but it went well for me when I played. This was my first time playing it. So yeah, you basically back in bird form again, and this is going to kind of test your skills with, navigating in bird form accurately through the gaps. It never moves too fast, but it does get pretty dense. There is a lot of pumpkins on screen at some point. So, it will kind of challenge your movement skill with the bird form. The main key, like I was saying before, though, I stick by that for all the bird sequences, is to just tap the button a few times, once or twice, and just get a few wing flaps and don't go crazy with it, So just do it carefully, and you should be able to get to where you want to get to. Don't be in a rush to mash through. Just play very carefully, calmly. Don't get overly excited with what's on screen. Remember, whenever you get to a boss, it's a permanent checkpoint. So, worst case scenario, if you die, you just start the boss over. Now, that kind of sucks for the last boss, since you got to beat a bunch of forms in one and 1 life. But for all the other bosses, it's not that big of a deal. You'll get it eventually. You can throw out the occasional. Remember, this bird can throw out an attack, a projectile. So you can throw it out occasionally to take out the tomatoes, which can kind of try to fuck with you while you're doing all this. So if you see a tomato, try to snipe it out if you can. If you don't kill it, I don't know really what it does. I usually just take them out. I don't know if it causes much of a problem. See, he just passed through the screen and he didn't even come back to fuck around. So I guess you could ignore them. You could probably even just fucking ignore them. Maybe you don't have to even kill them. The boss is going to just do a set amount of patterns as far as I think it's a set amount of patterns, unless you have to destroy a certain amount of tomatoes to make him come back. Maybe that's what it is. I'm honestly not sure. Maybe destroy them to be safe. But like I said, I only fought this once, so I'm not a master at this. But you have to hit the boss around the mouth area, I believe, when his face rotates. So when you have an opening, try to get a projectile in there, and that will hit the boss. So now it starts to get a little bit denser. I think there's 3 phases, as with most of these bosses. I usually take these things out. I think it does hurt him when you take out the tomato, because I see him flash. I wasn't paying attention to that at all when I played the game. I was just taking them out because I thought they might try to fuck with me, not knowing what they were going to do. You see fucking enemies moving around. It's a little suspicious, so try to snipe them out. But yeah, I guess you do have to take them out. Maybe that's why he didn't come sooner into the area. I guess you could probably beat him faster if you do better than I did. So let's see where I hit him. I think it's like the mouth area. It looked like it went through that little barrier around him too. So maybe it's around the mouth. I guess that's the general area that you're trying to land the shit into. I don't think it'll give you too much trouble. I think if you got this far, this guy is going to be the least of your issues. I mean, I think some of the other stages were definitely harder than this fight, but that's just my perspective. I guess I didn't get all the cutscenes. There was a lot of editing to do to get all the deaths out of a 5.5 hour video, and I didn't do it like super fucking carefully. I didn't even check my own edits, so I'm sure a few more deaths are going to get in. But I think that's fine. I don't think a few deaths is a problem. It does show kind of how the game works a little bit, and it does show that it was played by a fucking human and not any kind of cheat video, which I don't fucking do that shit. So now we're going to be on the third world, which I think there's only 2 more worlds left. So we are about halfway through the game at this point. Now the game is going to start to spike up a bit. So we will see some harder shit, but it's not going to be consistent. So don't worry about that too much. It's just going to be certain stages are going to stand out. But there's going to be a lot of stages that really aren't that much harder, maybe even easier than some of the ones we already beat. Like I said, it's not an even difficulty. So you can still beat the fucking game, even if you had some trouble. You should still be able to finish it off. Last boss will probably provide a challenge, though, so you're going to have to practice that. But even the last boss is more of a long memorization sequence. It's about 3 minutes long with no checkpoints. So it's kind of just a long memorization sequence, but it's probably the hardest part of the game, since it's pretty fucking long. 3 minutes is a long time to not be able to fuck up at all. It's a decent amount of time to have to be pretty precise. I mean, there's a little room for error. It's not like brutal or anything. It's not a brutal 3 minutes, but you really do have to know what you're doing on that part. So it can take some practice. So now we have the shark again. We get it real early in this stage. I like these little fucking animal scenes, though. They're fun parts of the game. They have a nice rhythm to them. They're all well done. So with these starfish, just avoid them. I was playing with a joystick, so sometimes I think maybe my swimming movement might not be as accurate as it would be with a analog stick. You get more range of movement, potentially. I'm not sure if the game takes advantage of that, though. It feels like a digital kind of game with, digital control, like just regular, standard, 8-direction D-pad kind of game. But some games are deceptive with that, some of these modern games. And, you play with a joystick, you're actually kind of gimping your movement, and you don't even realize it. When I was playing Downwell, when I beat that recently, I switched to an analog stick. I was using a modded joystick, and of course the joystick has the standard digital control of 8 directional control. So When I played it with the analog, I had so much more precision. So sometimes it's one of those things, you should try multiple controllers sometimes. Because, you may... I think I spent like 15 hours using a modded joystick, and then I switched to I played the PS5 version with an analog stick, killed it off in about 3.5 hours. Of course, I had a lot of practice by that point, but still, I think had I used the analog stick, I would have beat it a lot sooner. So here you see me holding down the jump button now, and I'm actually swimming at a faster speed, I believe. So I finally figured it out. It took me like half the game to figure that out. But there wasn't many shark sequences, so it did start to come to me. But yeah, hold down the jump button and you'll swim faster. And you just got to memorize the path through there and escape the enemy. You got to move fast in that part, otherwise you get your ass bit. So it is the first time that they make you move fast through a swimming stage. You just have to know. You have to know what's coming up. That's all. It just takes a little practice. You got a checkpoint, so I don't think that's going to be too hard. So this stage, I think this was one of the harder stages, if I remember right. I think this was one of the one I posted up in my difficult gameplay section highlight playlist, which I highlight some of the harder sections in games. So I think this was one of them that I featured. So that usually means it was one of the harder stages up until this point. So this was probably the hardest. This may have been the hardest stage for me up until this point of the game. So something to keep in mind. We'll see. I got to watch it to remember exactly what this was. I remember you do have to move fast because of the crumbling platforms, so you do really have to have it memorized. I don't think it gets too hard as of yet, but it does get more challenging a little later. Probably after this checkpoint. So you can go up and get the heart if you want. There's really not a big consequence. Just avoid the fucking carrots, but not a big deal. You're going to bounce onto the zip lines, off of enemies as needed. Use the hover, because a lot of times you're going to want to hover to avoid shit, as you see me doing. Also, sometimes you need the hover to cross certain gaps in these games, or in this game. Sometimes it kind of makes you use it. So if the jump is too wide, make a wide jump and then hover down, and that can give you a lot more distance. Bounce off this enemy, get back on the ropes. So pretty much just keep moving. You just got to find the rhythm to keep on moving, basically. There's a definite rhythm of movement to it. This part can be a little tricky. You got to kind of know what ropes to switch to, but it's always the same. You see I took a hit there. But it's a little tricky. I mean, it's really not that bad, but it was one of the harder ones for me, I think. I remember it being pretty challenging. But maybe I didn't spend, too much time on it. But it was one of the more challenging ones I thought early on. You definitely have to remember where to move to. It's probably not something you're going to brute force your first time through. You're probably going to have to die a few times. I think this one's pretty tricky too, if I remember right. The game is starting to escalate a bit. So the mechanic here is one that's been used since the old Super Mario Brothers, the original game. You jump on one side of the scale to make the other side go up, and then you can use that to get across. There's also, what else did we just see? There was also, there's also these bananas that shoot out. And the idea with that is the old, jumping on the turtle shells in Super Mario Brothers to get across shit. So you just got to jump from banana to banana sometimes. So yeah, this was tricky. This was actually one of the harder ones. This was definitely harder than the last stage. So this is one of the more challenging ones. Not yet, though. It's not too bad yet, but it gets a little challenging a little later in the stage. There's going to be some more advanced jumping on the fucking bananas and shit, where you have to jump across multiple of them, in midair. It's a little tricky. Try to get up on top of that banana dispenser any way you can. If you take a hit, it's okay. Make sure you got this thing high enough, and let the eggplant enemy come out and die in the water before you go across. It makes it easier. And then just go back. You can go back and forth on the platforms by raising up one end and then going back to the other side. So you don't have to keep moving forward. As long as you go back and raise the other one, you can do it. Make sure that last one is high enough to get up on this platform. So you can bounce off these bananas, so use that to get across to the dispenser where you can stand on top of the banana dispenser. So now it's going to start to get a little bit more detailed. Well, actually, no, maybe not. There is a harder one with these bananas. I was thinking of another stage. But you'll see it soon. I believe it's in this world, so we should see it soon. But even that one is a little bit challenging. It's not an easy stage. It's one of the harder ones, I think. But there is one that scales that up quite a bit from what I remember. I just don't remember which stage it was. I think these bananas only appear in this world, though. I don't think it's like a thing that carries over into the final world. But I could be wrong. It just seems like the kind of thing that would be a themed kind of thing, you know what I mean? Like for the specific world, but maybe not. I don't really remember the game that well, even though I just beat it. So here you got to stay ahead of this tornado. So, you want to keep moving. Now, with these things, you can decide, with the ones with the gear on them, the bow and arrow things with the gear around them, those ones you can time by pressing the jump button. The other ones are automatic, meaning that so you got your animal, which is your checkpoint, but the other ones are automatic. But these you can shoot out of them manually by pressing the button at, when you want to shoot out. So keep that in mind. You just got to time it. This guy can do air dashes, this animal, and it can also do a downward dash to bust through multiple enemies in a row, as you saw me do. So we got another checkpoint here. So you just got to be good with your dashes, and remember you can clamber onto the walls and climb up. So use that to your advantage. You're going to have to do that. You just got to time these and bounce off shit, that's all. It's really not hard. But you do have to know what's coming up. And this can be kind of a challenging stage. The dash is good though. Whether you use the horizontal version of the dash, which you can do in the air or on the ground, or if you use the downward dash, they will go through multiple enemies. So definitely don't dash down on an enemy that you want to bounce off of, because I think you'll go right through it and just die. So don't do that. With the dragon, it's different. When you're playing as the dragon, if you use your dash attack, it'll actually bounce off the enemies and spring you up in the other direction. So it's a little different with that character. I think this stage is also another pretty challenging one. So now you got these rings that you got to jump from, ring the ring. And you have to avoid the toxic lake, which I believe the lake is pretty much always coming up. And obviously if you get hit by the water, the toxic water, you just die. So, you want to avoid all that shit. There's some geysers in the background too. I think they may hurt you if you don't get, away from them in time. But, you should be moving so fast that those geysers aren't going to be much of a problem. So now we got a checkpoint. You can see the edit there. So we're doing a little bouncing on the bananas again. The hardest thing about this stage, really, for me, was just knowing exactly where the game wanted me to go. I died. The reason I died most of the time was because I didn't know where the game wanted me to go. It's not really clear in this stage, at least for me. There was a few dead ends where I wasn't sure if I was supposed to go left or right, or up or down, or what. So I died because I just didn't know what was coming up. So I found that to be the main challenge. The execution of the gameplay really didn't find it to be too hard. It's similar to everything we've done so far, I think. Maybe a little bit more aggressive with the banana bouncing, but I didn't find it to be anything too difficult. But I did die quite a few times because I just didn't know where to go at a few points. I mean, this is all very obvious, but I think there was one part where I just wasn't sure where exactly I needed to go. This is easy enough, but you can't take too long. I don't think this was, maybe I'm thinking of a later area that was a little trickier. A lot of these stages look similar. I don't think I had any problem trying to figure out where to go in that stage, but there was one that was similar where I don't think I was sure exactly where to go. The game mostly blends together, so But I do remember seeing it, I do remember a lot of this. So now we got these rides. Once you go on them, they kind of just automatically move, and you got to keep up with them. That's the idea for this stage. They usually don't get triggered until you actually touch them with your feet, I believe. So this stage was actually pretty challenging. You really do have to know exactly where to bounce to and land. But it's really just trial and error, like most of this game is. But it was probably one of the harder stages. Some of the more challenging stages, they start to show up more frequently near the end of the game. So now we're starting to see more challenging stages back to back, It's a little bit more consistent. Another checkpoint. So I think this is the hardest part of the stage and near the end of the stage. It's like the last half of the stage, I believe. So you got to go through a pretty long stretch here before you actually beat the stage, and there's no checkpoint, I don't believe. So, you will have to learn it. You can see the path I'm taking, pretty self-explanatory. You don't have to do it exactly this way, but you get the idea. There's not really too much to be aware here except for just learning the path and knowing, when to jump, where to go, etc. Just stay in the middle mostly here, move a little bit, stay in the middle and adjust your position left to right slightly, based on the spikes. The fireballs can make it a little tricky sometimes if you're trying to move. Sometimes they're in the way, so sometimes you got to jump over them or kind of move with them, in the gap. Same on the platform. Sometimes you got to jump while you're moving on the platforms. You'll have to jump a few times to let the fireballs pass so you can stay on the platform. And here you got to move pretty fast. Almost died there, pretty close. But mainly, it becomes pretty easy when you know what's coming up. That's the main thing. Just trial and error, just knowing what's coming up next. And once you know what to do, it's really not too hard. It's almost like an auto-scroller stage because it's mostly auto-scroller once your feet touch those platforms. So it's a pretty fast-paced stage. So this is the last stage before the semi-final boss. I think this might be the one with the aggressive... Actually, no, this is... this was one of the hardest ones for me. Because there was a mechanic in the game I didn't understand. I'm going to explain it. So basically, you want to avoid the red flowers and touch the blue flowers or the white flowers, whatever you want to consider them. But avoid the red ones. Touching the red ones makes the fish way more aggressive. So now we're going into an auto-scroller stage. Now, I didn't know this for a while, but I will learn after the checkpoint. But see that fish that's chasing you, the ghost fish? If you touch the red flowers, it's going to piss him off. If you touch the white ones, it'll freeze him in place. So always touch the white flowers. Try not to hit those red flowers. If you hit those, that's going to make the fish go wild. And you see I'm avoiding them at this point. Maybe I already knew not to touch them. But it's going to make things worse if you touch the red flowers. So that's all you need to know. I didn't know that, and it made the stage way harder for me. So it's just a matter of knowing when to double jump, when to dive. You see, it's very precise. And you're just going to learn that through trial and error. I mean, you can see what I'm doing. Sometimes you actually want to run off a ledge and fall off completely and then do your double jump. So that those can be tricky little jumps sometimes that you have to do. See, like there? Sometimes that's what you have to do. So be aware of that. It's not always just straight up double jump, and sometimes you're going to fall off the ledge purposely and then save yourself with a jump in midair. So that may catch some players off guard. But it's really just trial and error. And it is one of the harder sequences for sure. You got to know when to dive, when to double jump, when to regular jump. You got to know when to do everything. So this can take some trial and error. See, I do touch the red flowers sometimes, but you really don't want to do that because it speeds up the fish, makes them way more. That part at the end is a little tough. You really got to have that down with those three things. I got kind of lucky there because you can easily go in the pit when you got to bounce on those three things. I think I did a dive when I should have just did regular jumps, but That's all shit that you will be able to learn when you play it. It's going to be trial and error, so expect to repeat that part quite a bit. It's one of the hardest sections of the game. But I think it will save players a lot of time by knowing not to touch the red flowers. I didn't realize that was a bad thing until I watched a playthrough video. So this is one of the harder bosses. Definitely a challenging boss. You want to dash for the ones on the ground because you can dash across them. If you place your dash just right, you'll dash fully across those rows. See that row? I dashed across it. You want to do those one for the ground ones, like these. And then for the big one here is going to go when you go to the wall. And then you got to go back across and hit the boss. So, you got to look at the purple markers to see where the attacks are going to come out at. And there's some tricky dodging in this second phase. So you got to switch sides really fast. You have to have that timing down very well. See, then you got to go all the way to the other side, back again. You really got to know what to do, and that's memorization. But that's the best I can explain it. Usually when you see two of them active at one time on the ground, that means you're going to have to go all the way to the other side. But not the easiest thing to explain. You really got to practice that and get the patterns down for that. Because it's the same every time. It doesn't change. You just have to memorize this. So for this part, you're mostly going to stay between these walls, but you got to move a lot. And, like I said, this is kind of hard to explain exactly. But there's times when you see the full wall fill up with purple, that means you got to go to the other side and climb all the way up and go all the way to the top. And you see, I still took a hit here. But you really got to, memorize what to do when. And, of course, that's when you can hit the guy. When he comes out with his little crew, there's an opening. You got to jump over it and hit him. That is one of the hardest bosses. Aside from the final boss, that's probably the hardest boss in the game. And that is the semi-final boss. So you may have to practice that quite a bit. The second phase, especially, I found, can be tricky because you got to kind of weave in and out. You got to move left to right pretty quick. You got to know exactly when to do those movements. I will say that whenever that purple shit shows up, I think it's pretty much the exact amount of time each time when the attack comes out, when the eggplants shoot out. So if you're paying attention to when they appear, you can kind of try to time when they're going to come out. That's probably the best I can explain it. But you really have to be on top of it as far as being ready to move, left to right, because there's parts where the screen is packed with those things, and you got to find those exact gaps to when you can move safely to one side or the other, and then you'll have to move back again several times. So it's tricky, but it's really just pattern memorization. You just got to get the patterns down. So this is the final world. And there are some tricky stages here. And, of course, the final boss is going to be the hardest part. There's usually 9 stages in each world, so there's still a nice little chunk of game left. So I think this is another stage where you got to move pretty fast. There may be lava coming up. I don't remember exactly. I don't remember this first stage being particularly difficult. That's like what I said, how the game has kind of uneven difficulty where some parts are much harder earlier on in the game, and then something like this was actually pretty easy, I thought. I don't remember this stage being tough. I mean, this is pretty standard shit. So now we have another bird scene. It may be a little bit of a more aggressive bird scene than some of the earlier ones, but I don't remember it being challenging. I don't think you have to rush this part. I don't know if there's anything coming from the left side or anything. I think you can kind of just take your time and get in the gaps. Of course, when the fireballs are behind you, you got to keep moving pretty much. Or you could just move up and down, I guess, but it's better to keep moving. So you can go through the middle of those stars. That might be easier. I like going through small gaps, but you don't necessarily need to do that. Here you're just weaving left and right to avoid the fireballs. Obviously, you can see when the fireballs dispense out of those plants, so you want to time it accordingly. This is a little tricky. You got to get in the gaps and then move with these two stars, and then get in the gap of the other set and move with it. So that part's actually tricky because the flapping control isn't great. So it can be a little tricky to keep up with them without getting hit. That's one of the harder parts of the stage. It may be the hardest part of this stage. Same thing here, except now it's horizontal sets of starfish or whatever that you got to stay between. Use your attacks to break through those cactus barriers. So here you're just going down. And you can play this part very carefully. It's not difficult. I think this is a little bonus area, but you do get an extra piece of health. So I think 2 is the max. I don't know if you can stack health. I think you can only stack 1. So just get in the middle here and then move up when you have a clear path. Same type of fireball setup here as you did earlier. Take this little path up. You have to navigate a few of them this time, but it's not too hard. I believe this is the end of the stage. Yeah, this is it. Really not too hard. I mean, I didn't find it to be a difficult stage. I thought it was quite a bit easier than some of the other stages, so that's why I was saying the difficulty can be pretty uneven. Because this is one of the final stages. But I do remember there being a few challenging stages in this final world. I'll definitely have to see them to remember which ones they were. So similar thing here. You're using these air currents to hover and move up and down. But this time you have to avoid the hurricane on the left side, so you got to move fast. That's the main difference between the last time we had to deal with this. So again, it's just a matter of knowing the route. You just have to know where and when to go where. It's pretty simple. So already we have our first checkpoint. Some of the eggplants you'll want to bounce over, and then I believe some of them you're going to want to go under. Remember, you can drop off the ropes at any time, so it's faster to do that. You can drop down on that enemy and bounce off it to get an extra health piece, which is easy to do, and I think it's worth it, because it is easy to take a hit at certain points, even when you know it pretty well. So you want to move fast on the ropes, jump up the ropes quickly. Here we're going to do some bouncing to get across. As soon as you land on the platform, you're going to want to jump immediately to get over that little porcupine. Remember that you'll just do a tiny little bounce hop if you don't hold the button down. So just do little small bounces to get under that spike ceiling. And then I believe you hold it down for the big bounce that you need to get across. So that's a skill that you're going to have to use at certain points in the game with those bouncing purple platforms. More enemy bouncing, really not too crazy. I thought this was also one of the easier ones for a late game stage. I mean, you can see it's nothing too much harder than what we've dealt with. I think these two stages were easier than a lot of the earlier ones. I think Jelly Dungeon is a little tricky. If I remember right, I think it might be a little tricky. It's going to test your bouncing skills with those purple platforms I mentioned. You're gonna have to be able to switch fast between the tiny bounces and the long jumps. You're gonna have to get good at doing that. That's actually the main skill set for this little stage. So get used to doing that. Varying your bounces from the small hop to the full bounce. You also got to know when to fire onto these things to get in the gaps, and basic path memorization. So a little trial and error. Definitely, as you can tell, one of the denser and more difficult stages in the game. But by this point, you don't have really that much left to beat the game. I think the next biggest obstacle is going to be the final boss fight, so expect to practice that for a while. I think that probably took me over an hour to beat. So that was one of the harder parts of the game. So you're going to do small hops for those parts to get across those long stretches. And, move with the fireball. You don't want to do any big hops in those narrow corridors, obviously, or you'll hit the spikes. Here you just got to know which enemies to bounce off of and which ballistas to go into. So if you're unsure, just, follow the path I took. That's the easiest way to explain it. Time your shot here to get in the gap. And that's pretty much it, but it's actually a pretty challenging stage. It's one of the harder ones. It's pretty dense. I mean, for this game anyway. We are pretty far into the final stage, though, by this point. All right, yeah, maybe this is the harder of the stages I remember with all the banana bouncing. This may be it. I think this was another one I featured on the difficult sections playlist. I only featured a few stages in that playlist from this game, so there was a few standouts. And I believe this was one of them. So, yeah, of course it's going to be more pathfinding. Obviously, I mean, that's what these games are. It's just finding the path, but there's a few parts that I can break down a little bit more than that. So here we have auto-scrolling again. With the lizard form, you get it early into the stage. And that's a checkpoint as well. So here you're going to be tested in having to switch fast and move fast and really have it memorized. So this is going to, challenge you probably more. So I didn't even want to go into that bonus stage, but if you go in there like that, I guess that's a bonus stage. So I may show that here just because I ended up doing that on my successful attempt. So I just left it in. But yeah, you can fail these. It doesn't matter. I don't think there's any problem to failing. It'll just bring you back out to around the area that you were at. Completing these doesn't warp you ahead of the stage or anything, so there's really no benefit to go in here. It's not like a warp pipe. It's not like in Super Mario Brothers when you go in a green pipe and get some coins and then you come out later in the stage or something. It doesn't have that effect. So either jump or bounce on those green helmeted guys. Remember, whenever you see those, the game is telling you to bounce off of them in some form. Either dive down at them or just jump off of them. Sometimes you may need to double jump. So here you want to get in the air sometimes if the banana is not aligned with you, so that you can kind of line up with it and bounce off of it to get across some of those areas. And you're going to have to bounce off multiple of them in a row at certain points. Bounce off this eggplant. Just keep going. Now here you got to bounce off multiple, so you want to jump and then dive, jump and then dive. Jump off it, then dive. You see what I'm doing? That's the best way to do it, I think. And now you got to jump across all of these. But yeah, that part can be tricky with bouncing on the multiple bananas, as you have to cross that large area with just jumping on the bananas. So that takes some practice to get the rhythm down. But there is a rhythm to it. You got to know when to bounce, when to double jump. Everything you have to have down. You can't really miss any movements or you'll die. So you have to have it memorized. It's alright if you take a hit on these eggplants. Sometimes it's an easy place to take a hit, but that's why there is a heart I believe you get that helps if you take an extra hit. But for the most part, you have to have this down pretty flawlessly. So it is one of the harder stages. This may be the hardest actual stage aside from the final boss. But that's it. But yeah, that's a long stretch with no checkpoints, so you do have to really have that down. And if you do get the heart, you can take one hit at least. But for the most part, you have to have that down pretty flawlessly. So you're going to have to practice that. But if you watch how I played it, there's a very particular way to play it. Everything is done for a reason. And you just got to practice it and memorize it. And if you're having trouble, then definitely study the video and try to emulate those movements. Because, every time I switch to a different rope, it's all done for a reason. Every movement is precise. So I believe this may be another chase sequence a little later in the stage, if I remember right. I don't remember this chase sequence, though. If it is a chase sequence, I don't remember it being as hard as that last one where the thing was chasing you and you had to hit all the white and red bulbs. I remember the last one being harder, but maybe this will jog my memory when I see it. I'm not even sure if it is another chase sequence. Right now, you just got to collect the bulbs to make those things descend into the ground. But yeah, now is a chase, so I guess it is. I'll have to see it again. I don't remember it being as hard as the last one, but yeah, because you get the shark, I think you can swim through a lot of this stage. So the swimming stages I find tend not to be as difficult as some of the ones where you're running through shit. But I think it was a little tricky. I don't remember the stage being that hard though. So again, you can hold the jump button to move at a faster base speed, basically like running. And the little dive attack is a good way to move fast too. If you kind of mash it carefully. And also, if you're using the dive attack while it's active, it will take out most of the enemies. But I really only kill shit when it's in my way. I'm not trying to actively target anything. Mostly just trying to bust through. So there's your first checkpoint. If you swim down there like that, you can usually avoid that first spread shot. But by the time I explain it, the shark is already, a lot farther, so it's kind of hard to keep up with. I will say that, though, there is a reason for all this movement. The way I'm moving, it's all memorized, for the most part. So it's all repeatable. Like, whatever you see me doing, it's all shit that you can pretty much repeat each time. So even though I am cutting it close, it was because I got used to the stage. And I tend to play kind of dangerous, where I cut things really close, but it's something that you can repeat. But you can also play it a little differently. You don't have to cut shit that close. You can find your own path with it, but it's just a little bit of memorization. But it's really not that hard compared to the other stages. Maybe a little challenging. Took me a few tries. So now this is getting closer to the end now. There's a few more stages left. This one's pretty challenging. You have to kind of, with these platforms, you're going to see there's a solid yellow line vertically that the platforms ride on. Sometimes it's horizontal, but when that yellow line turns brown, that means that the platform's going to flip down. So pay attention to that. You'll see that tells you when the platform is going to flip down. So that means if you're on the platform when it flips down, you're going to fall off. So that's the main mechanic here that the game is introducing. As long as you understand that, that's the first step. You just got to pay attention to that. And you got to know when to be on platforms and where. I think this was the one where I got a little bit lost or confused about where exactly the game wanted me to go. That's probably what I was thinking about. But yeah, so you just got to know when to jump across. Based on when those lines turn solid yellow means the platforms are going to be up. And if it's not, it's going to go down. So you got to look out for that. Bounce across the enemies. Gets a little trickier later into the stage. Remember, this character can dash and climb up the walls, so use that. So this is the next checkpoint. And you're basically going to want to be going on the platforms, when you see me going on them and following what I'm doing, basically. Because, like I said, there's definitely a reason, especially in these harder stages, there's a reason pretty much for every movement. So, if unsure, just follow the way I'm doing it. The main thing is to understand, how the platforms work and not just thinking that they're random. They're not random at all, and they're very predictable just by looking at the solid yellow lines. That will tell you everything you need to know. So here you go up the left wall, then go back, dash back to the right to get back on this platform. Ride back to the left one. Now bounce off of these. And it's all done at the exact time you see me doing it. Now you go up to the left wall here. This is where I got kind of lost initially. Now you come back to these platforms again. Just beware of the little gaps where the platforms will drop, those little brown gaps on the solid yellow line. Now go back to the right and clamber up this wall. And that's pretty much the hardest part of the stage, I think. Yeah, that's the end of the stage, actually. So, very easy. Now come here and dash back to the left. That was the trickiest part. That little end part with the little gaps and shit, and you got to go on the walls. That's where I got kind of lost. I didn't know exactly where I was supposed to go. Because that right wall with the slope on it near the end doesn't really look that enticing as far as a place to go, but that's all it was. I just had to go back there. But I was going in the pit a few times because I didn't really understand where the game wanted me to go. So I think this is a pretty challenging platforming stage with these rotating platforms. The stages are getting pretty challenging near the end. So you're just going to follow these around, and it's going to vary depending on what's going on, but it's easy to get this heart here, at least, so you can take an extra hit. It's very easy to get. So you might as well get that. You can use your spin attack on the platforms. Just don't hold it down and go off the platform. Use a little brief spin attack to take those out. Or that one guy that I killed. Here you want to kind of ride these around until you have an opening to get on that far right platform safely. I hit into something there. I don't know what it was, but it was good I had that extra hit point. So bounce off this guy when he's kind of far off to the right so you can get across. Now you're going to be bouncing on a bunch of enemies. Luckily, the plant-headed enemies don't die when you bounce on them, unlike other enemies. So you can just keep bouncing on them for as long as you need, and adjust. You can adjust your movement from there. But these tomato guys without the helmet will die as soon as you bounce on them, so be aware. You also can't go into a hover from a bounce. So if you bounce off an enemy, you can't then hold the hover button. It won't work. So for bouncing, you have to set up your bounces so that you immediately know where you're going to go next. You can't hover and fuck around. You have to be ready to go to wherever you need to go. But you can bounce in place on these enemies for as long as you need a lot of times and figure out where exactly you need to bounce off to at the end. You see me, I was bouncing several times on that moving lettuce helmeted enemy. So now let this drop and then bounce down on that. And just bounce on these in the order you see me doing it. Stay on this one for a little while and bounce around until you can safely get to the platform. And now bounce across. You can see it's tricky. Spam your dash move here, or your spin attack. It allows you to move very fast, and it makes it easier to get across those flames. If you don't do that, I don't know if you can run fast enough, so I like to mash that. So now I believe we're on the final boss. Yep, final boss. So this is the hardest part of the game. And this is all memorization. But it's about 3 minutes straight with no checkpoints. So you're going to have to learn this in full. And this is probably the part that took me the longest. You're pretty much going to go through all the animal forms and a bunch of other shit. So here what you want to do is you got to collect these purple gems. You have as much time as you need to collect them, but just don't get hit. If you get hit on this first form, just commit suicide. It's not worth it because it's a long fight. That's what I did. So you're looking at this blue outline of the laser. It's going to start off kind of like dark, and when it gets bright is when it will injure you. So you got to move before that happens. But all you got to do is memorize where these gems are going to appear, and you'll memorize your gaps and when to get them. And then after you collect enough of them, he's going to go up to the center of the screen. It's going to open up, and then you can bounce on him. You got to memorize that. But the key to that is that if you stay in the middle platform, the boss will hover around you and not hurt you. So there's kind of a safe spot with that if you watch. Now with this, there's not a safe spot. So you just have to keep moving and avoiding this guy and collecting the gems. Now if you miss a gem, you might be able to get it later in the stage. I'm not sure, but I would always get all of them. You got to know when to drop down, where to jump, where to hover, and all that shit by memorizing the layout. But it's always the same. But everything I do is pretty specific. See, I go back there and then come back. That's all very specific. I pretty much do a lot of the same shit every time I do this section. So now you're going to go up here and then jump back around and land on them. So now we go to the next animal farm. It's a little, form. It's a little shark swimming bullshit. Pretty simple. You want to hold down the accelerate button and just kind of go in between the gaps. And it's always the same. This part can be a little tricky sometimes because it can be easy to miss the gems, but eventually you're going to know where they appear. They always appear in the same spot. That one's a little tricky to get without getting hit, but you can do it. If you miss one, I think you can probably get another one later, so I don't think you have to be perfect. Main thing is not to get hit by the boss. The boss, can be a little tricky. At that point, they're gonna like cover the whole screen except for a middle section, the lasers, and you got to be right in the middle to dodge those. So you got to be ready for that one. It's easy to get caught off guard by that because that's the only part of the fight where the lasers fill up the entire screen except for a little middle slither. So you got to be aware of that one. But then once you get to the top, you'll be able to get another hit in. Now we're on the final form, the final animal form. And this is just memorization. You got to know when to double jump, when to dive. There is a part where you got to run off one of the platforms and then kind of correct your jump midair as you're falling. So, that may not be obvious right away. But there's a part where you have to do that. So watch the video and carefully examine that. And you'll know exactly when to do the double jump and the dive. So this is the same kind of thing where you got to clamber on these walls and dash. And this section is pretty easy, I thought. But you do have to know what to do. Just wait on this wall, stay in place, and then dash across, and that's it. The boss is done. But yeah, for that first form with the gems that you got to collect in the very first phase of the battle, if you stay in the middle, the boss will actually circle around you and it can't hurt you. So the only time you're really in danger is when you move out to the right or the left. When you're moving out to the right or the left to try to get the gems, that's when the boss can easily hit you. So keep in mind, it's kind of a safe spot in the middle on that first phase. But if you die on that first phase, or if you get hit on that first phase, just commit suicide and start it over because it's a long fight. You don't want to take your first hit on that first phase. It's just a waste. Unless you're just practicing and you don't care. But aside from that, let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.